Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Your Views on the News, a special edition looking at the cases of extradition that has taken place in the last few weeks in the UK. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined in the studio by Sagheer Hussain, who's a director at Cage Prisoners. Assalamu alaikum. Andrew Slaughter, who's a MP, and I believe Shadow Justice Minister.
That's right, yes.
Good evening, and thank you for coming in. And Victoria Brittain, former assistant editor at The Guardian and author as well. Enemy Combatant, I think, is the book. Good evening to you as well.
Good evening.
Thank you all for joining us. Now, the earlier two segments, Sagheer, one of the things that came out very strongly was how these two cases of Gary McKinnon, his extradition being stopped by the Home Secretary, but the cases of Babar Ahmad and others, they weren't, and that there is double standards here, hypocrisy. Is there any legal differences, or as the Home Office would like to claim, that each case is, needs to be measured or kind of judgment given on its own merits?
Yeah. Can I just first point out that the fundamental problem with the 2003 Extradition Act, which was that it took away the power from English judges to decide whether there's a possible case against the person being summoned by the Americans. And it was just almost like an administrative process where once a demand has been made by an American clerk, I would say, in any state, the judges had very little power. So that's the basis on which most of this case work has been going on since 2003. The only thing left was Article 3 under the European Convention, where if somebody was likely to face degrading, inhumane treatment. And as you know, in the European Court, it finally decided a few months ago that surprisingly, that the American prisons, despite their 23 hours, if not more, solitary confinement, isolation for decades, some cases, that it wasn't inhumane. Then the other issue that arose was the one about the mental health, and this is where the people have been quite astounded at the moving of the goalpost by the government in a matter of days. So on the day we had Talha shipped off to America, they said no, there's no problem with his mental health, there's no situation with him facing any degrading treatment, there's no problem to his life, and therefore he has to go because the treaty really gives us very little choice. Then of course literally a few days later, for Gary McKinnon, who doesn't happen to be a Muslim and who doesn't happen to be a brown person. And let me say clearly, first of all, that Cage Prisoners and most Muslims who supported Babar and Talha also supported Gary McKinnon. Yeah. There's a very good working relationship between different families to ensure that everybody, saw the same thing and fought for the same thing. Yet, despite that, the government has cynically sought to play on people's underlying prejudice and to say, well, not even say, they didn't need to. It's the contempt, it's the lack of any consideration whatsoever that how this may be perceived, the difference in opinion. So really, there's no legal difference between Talha and Gary McKinnon whatsoever.
Okay, I do have Nigel Mills from the Conservatives on the phone as well, but before I come to him, Andrew, I'd like to bring you in. One of the other things the families did say is that this is actually quite political. The decision is a political decision. Mr. McKinnon's case was put off for many months, and basically, even the Home Secretary and others, they did not hide the fact that they were very happy that they managed to ship Talha, Babar, and others, across the pond.
As you see, there are a number of different issues here. There was the issue of conditions in US jails. That was what went through the European Court. There's the issue of risk to life, mental health, etc., which was the issue that finally led the Home Secretary to decide Gary McKinnon shouldn't go, which I agree with. But what concerned me most was what the Home Secretary went on to say about extradition policy generally. She felt quite rightly she had to make to deal with a number of the issues that were outstanding that had been raised in several debates in Parliament over the last year. And the leading one of those, which was absolutely front and centre in Babar Ahmad's and indeed Talha's case, is if there was evidence against them, then why weren't they being tried in the UK? And you remember there was 150,000 people have signed a petition, not to say don't proceed, but proceed, if you're going to proceed in the UK.
Put them on trial here.
Put them on trial here. And there is no case, I think, more than the case of Babar and Talha, which deals with that issue, because clearly what they're alleged to have done happened in the UK, and the connection with America is tangential. So you would have thought that would have been the case. And yet, when the Home Secretary made her statement this week, she said that from now onwards, that what's called the forum test, i.e. you decide where's the most appropriate area, will now come into effect. It was something that the Labour government legislated for, but has not come into effect in British law yet. It will now. And so I asked the question to the Home Secretary in the House of Commons, why didn't you make this decision 2 or 3 weeks ago, before the extraditions took place?
Yes.
And I think it's highly significant that after 9 years that Babar Ahmad and Talha were in prison without charge, that it's only 2 weeks later that change in the law, which would have quite likely, you can't say definitely, but quite likely meant they would have been tried in the UK.
Well, we've got Nigel Mills on the phone, who's from the Conservative Party, I believe, who also is a supporter of the Gary McKinnon, Stop Gary McKinnon extradition case. Good evening, Mr. Mills. Can you hear us?
Yep, good evening.
Thank you for joining us. Just really picking up from what Mr. Slaughter had to say here about the Home Secretary's announcement, the timing of this forum bar. A lot of people are seeing it as quite cynical and perhaps biased against the Muslims, the 5 Muslims that were extradited.
I probably agree the timing is very unfortunate, although I think that is the right decision. That if offences have been committed in Britain, they ought to be tried in Britain as the first place for that, rather than it being abroad. Clearly, where an offence is committed against a different country or in a different country, that's a different matter. I can't answer for the Home Secretary as to why that's the timing's there, but of course all these cases have had due process through the courts, and I have to say I'm not overly comfortable with the Home Secretary having sort of like final sign-offs in individual cases anyway. I mean, I sort of think that politicians should set the law and set the policy, and we should leave the courts to try individual cases.
I mean, you say due process, and that's exactly what the Security Minister said in reply to the question that, you know, the families do feel that there is double standards. But can you appreciate how the families are feeling like this? In particular, the family of Talha Ahsan, whose son also suffers from Asperger's.
Of course, I can appreciate that if they both have similar medical conditions, end up with a different result. But I guess if I was their family, I'd feel aggrieved about that. Of course, I said none of us have seen the medical assessments for both cases to actually know exactly what's in them and how similar they are. So, you know, it's hard to comment and say, well, one's been decided wrongly here. But yes, if I was their family, I would probably have the same feelings.
And would you say the special relations that America has with Britain is part of this? Is a lot of people saying David Cameron did mention about Gary McKinnon, but did not talk about the other British citizens that were also facing extradition?
Well, I think you spoke about some of the others, but perhaps not quite in the way some of your listeners would have liked. I'd say, politicians talking about individual cases, especially at senior government level, I'm not sure is a very healthy situation. You know, I think it's much better to let the courts decide on the evidence rather than risk getting these cases dragged into a political situation. You know, when there's a lot of pressure around to do things which may not lead to the right result.
And just finally, one more, Mr. Mills. I appreciate you're on the phone on a Sunday evening. With Gary McKinnon, the alleged crime that he was said to have committed was to hack into high security American military computers, which he admitted to. But the crime took place here in the UK. With the cases, let's just say Talha Ahsan and Babar Ahmad, they're alleged to have run a website which promoted war or some kind of war in Afghanistan along those lines, which they've denied doing. In terms of the severity, do you see them as same? I mean, we just as layperson here, the viewers here, are trying to understand, the gravity of the case with Mr. McKinnon and the gravity of the cases with these two individuals. Yet it's these two individuals who go to America to face trial and perhaps life imprisonment.
I mean, Mr. McKinnon's offence, which I think you're right, he has admitted, is a very serious offence that he ought to be tried for. Obviously, he has a defence that he was looking for the details of alien landings, but it's quite right the court should decide whether they believe that or not. But of course, the other gentleman's offences are also extremely serious. I mean, they're effectively accused of inciting war, which is something that, again, if there's evidence, they should be properly tried for. I have no problem with them. If people are accused of that having a day in court, and if it can be proven, then they should be strongly punished for it, clearly. So I would say both offences are very serious. As to whether...
Equally serious, Mr. Mills?
It's hard to equate. I mean, if Mr. McKinnon is telling the truth, he was looking for evidence of alien abductions, that's clearly not as serious as trying to incite holy war. But clearly, hacking into the Pentagon's computer system, and it's quite amazing that one young man sat in the UK can achieve that in the first place. It's a very serious offence. I can see why the Americans would very much want to put him on trial for that, but he wasn't inciting or supporting warfare in that, so that may be a slightly less serious offence, but that doesn't change the fact that both are very serious.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mills, for joining us this evening. Victoria, if I can bring you in before our callers, we have got a number of callers to come in.
Well, I would just like to pick up from the last thing said by the other MP. Let's just be quite clear that what he is describing as very serious offences, Gary McKinnon admitted to his offences. The other two are accused of these offences,
right,
but they have said that they didn't do them. So let's not kind of equate them in that way. But I'd like to also go back to the question of double standards, because I think what is patently clear and why it's not just the families who are so angry. I think there's a huge community which is not entirely Muslim, which sees extreme hypocrisy and double standards in this. And one of the elements of that is that Mrs. May, when she made her much praised statement in the House of Commons, she didn't talk about Asperger's. She talked about risk of suicide. And she emphasised that many times. And I think it's impossible for anybody not to realise that the reason she didn't use the word Asperger's was because of the awkwardness this would put her in with the Talha case. But in fact, in the witness statements and affidavits on Mr. McKinnon and on Talha and on Adel Abdul Bari, the same phrases about mental health, serious mental health issues is there. Now, Talha himself frequently told me on the phone, he was a bit of a frequent phoner, and one of the things he used to say to me was, I don't want people standing around talking about me going to kill myself or me being mad. And it was a matter both of pride for him, as he said, middle-class Asian families don't talk about those things. And the same was true for the Egyptian, who, let's remember, we in Britain kept for 13 years in prison when there was nothing against him here. And in fact, there was a letter from the Metropolitan Police saying that they had found no evidence of any terrorist intentions.
And the person we're talking about here?
Is Adel Abdul Bari, who's an Egyptian human rights lawyer, who was given political asylum here after he was tortured by the Mubarak government. And of course, as far as that government was concerned, he was an opposition person. But all the people who were his friends and associates from that period are now in power in Egypt. And we in Britain, instead of handing him over to Egypt, to his friends and allies, we went along completely blindly with what the Americans were asking. And I never met anybody that I've ever said, we in Britain kept a man for 13 years in prison here without them expressing horror, embarrassment, shame. And I think this is very important to remember, that there's that other case in there.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll just take a quick call and I'll come back to the rest of the panelists. I believe Haroon from London is online. Assalamu alaikum, Haroon.
Hello, assalamu alaikum. I'm just wondering, we've got a Muslim Shadow Justice Secretary in Sadiq Khan, who's also the MP for Babar and Talha, I believe. Can I just ask, has he been asked to come on this show? Because, yes, he's written lots of letters, but I haven't heard much from him regarding his constituents. I think he could have been a lot more supportive. And in all honesty, what's the point of him being Justice Secretary if he's not going to do anything?
Okay, and if we take our next caller, I believe it's a sister from Woking. Assalamu alaikum. You're on air, sister. Your views, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I believe it was blatant double standards being applied here. And I wanted to know what happened to the Britain being so fair on with the basically what happened to the innocent until proven guilty. Babar Ahmad hasn't done anything, I believe. Maybe he didn't actually do anything, but this McKinnon guy has actually gone into the security, that he knows exactly what was happening in there, and he could have done a lot of damage. He did do a lot of damage, but the other guys who have gone, who have been extradited, haven't done anything. They haven't been proved to be guilty.
Okay. Well, Sagheer,
do you want to
perhaps I'm the person to deal with Sadiq, and I'm very pleased Sadiq Khan is the Shadow Justice Secretary. I'll be even more pleased when he's the Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, and that's not just because he's a Muslim, because he's an extremely highly regarded human rights lawyer. And I disagree with your caller. I suspect that if you talk to Babar or Talha's family, they would say that Sadiq has given them huge support over the years. There is simply a parliamentary rule, which is that if you're in the cabinet or shadow cabinet, you do not speak out on individual cases in Parliament or in that way, or on the media. And I'm sure Sadiq finds that frustrating, but it doesn't stop him doing everything he can to support the case of the families as a constituency MP. And I just want to put that on the record and make that clear.
Can I just give a little history?
Go ahead.
May I give a little history here? Within a few days when Babar Ahmad was arrested, in Tooting we had a big general meeting, which I chaired, and Sadiq was our main guest. He was a prospective parliamentary candidate at the time for Tooting. And he assured everybody, Babar was his friend from school, from football days. He knew him, he supported him all along, and the whole of Tooting was with Sadiq subsequently at the election. Unfortunately, as we know, as you said, the courts have had no power in this. By definition, the treaty has given no power to the courts. All the power, whether to deal with the extradition, was in Parliament. Sadiq has sadly let everyone down. Babar's family and Talha's family, I fully respect them. They're absolutely desperate because they know what they're facing. That they've always tried what they can. Any crumbs of support Sadiq has offered, they've given, they've accepted. Nevertheless, Sadiq has been far less than disingenuous in this situation here. He not only avoided extradition debates in Parliament, going off here and there, so that not to make a contribution. He also, when it came to actually changing policy, now this guy was the campaign manager for Ed Miliband. Are you telling me that he didn't have the confidence or the ability to assert himself and try to change the Labour policy's disgraceful policy on extradition, as compared when there's so much support even in the Lib Dems, even so much support in the Conservative Party, yet he never raised his head. So the question I leave to ask is, we have an MP, we have a Shadow Justice Secretary who doesn't have the confidence, because I have no doubt he wanted Babar and Talha to stay, who didn't have the confidence to assert himself in Parliament where it mattered. That will leave a lot of questions answered. And I'll leave you one final thing. In Tooting, there's always been, over the last few years, there's a motto going around. If Babar and Talha go, Sadiq goes. Sadiq's got a very short majority. I would ask him
I don't think we want to get into that conversation.
I just must say one further word on that. Sure. I mean, I think this programme should be about Babar Ahmad and Talha, not about Sadiq Khan, and I'm not sure how much clearer I can make matters. When I spoke on Babar and Talha's behalf in one of the extradition debates we had last year, Sadiq was sitting next to me there and was there to give support to the families. He is not permitted. It's not a question of not wanting to. He is not permitted as a member of the shadow cabinet to, and you can't be oppositionist all your life. If you want, I'm very proud that Sadiq is the first Muslim to be in the cabinet when he was, and is likely to be the next Lord Chancellor in this country. Those are simply the rules.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a difference here. I mean, if he's not permitted to do something, then he's not permitted. Yes, Victoria.
I'd like to add something from a different point of view to this bit of the conversation. We had a meeting in the House of Commons at which Sadiq Khan was one of the speakers, and his opening remarks were, let us park at the door the idea that this meeting is something about Muslims. In fact, it was about 4 people. It was about Gary and Richard O'Dwyer and about Babar and Talha. But by saying that this has nothing to do with Muslims, he not only confused the issue, because as we then began to talk later, he unfortunately left the room, I had to say that let us be clear, there is a racial aspect and there is a religious aspect to this. There are 2 people out of these 4 who almost certainly will not be extradited, and there are 2 who will go to courts in America who American lawyers themselves say are weighted against Muslims. So that aspect, we don't like to believe in Britain that we still have institutional racism. But actually, let us look at the events of the last month. I think it's really hard to get away from it. And I'm afraid that your colleague didn't help this by going into that area.
I'll give Duncan the last word, but Duncan, if you can just... Andrew. I'm still calling you Duncan.
Hindsight's a wonderful thing, Victoria.
It's not hindsight. I was in the room with you.
But Andrew, do you understand the point? Many people were feeling that the Muslims will get extradited.
I think the comments I made previously, you'll see that I absolutely agree with you now that double standards have operated in this case. And I think, okay, it may only be circumstantial evidence, but it's very, very strong circumstantial evidence as to when these announcements, changes in policies were made, 2 weeks, no more than 2 weeks after the extradition took place. I think what Sadiq's saying is that's not the way it should operate. The way it should operate is it should be. No one's asking for special treatment for Muslims. What we're asking for is what I would like to think British justice provides or ought to provide. And if it's
I'm actually running out of time. In my ear,
if it is falling short,
can I just say,
then that needs to be addressed.
Just thank you very much. I have literally run out of time, and thank you all for coming. Apologies, Andrew, for calling you Duncan. I tried to avoid it all throughout the show, but I've said it. Just viewers, we are going to come back to finish the programme off. Inshallah, we will have Peter Oborne and Jeremy Corbyn in the studio with David Bermingham on the phone. So see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum.